I think that by the autumn, most G7 countries will be in recession. The war will have intensified. Central banks will be very concerned, and led by the Fed, we will see the G7 central banks either by the autumn or in the fourth quarter completely turning policy upside down by turning the credit taps full on. Because by the autumn on our work, we will see most global equity markets falling by 30 to 35%.
Welcome to the third and final installment of our in-depth economic series featuring the esteemed economist Simon Hunt. In the previous part, BRICS Currency Threat to G7 Hegemony, Part 2, click on the above card to watch later, Simon discussed the rising influence of BRICS nations and their potential threat to the G7. Today, he takes us further into the complex landscape of the global economy, predicting a looming recession for G7 countries, a drastic plunge in global equity markets, and an imminent recession in the US. He also uncovers intriguing conspiracy theories about the Nordstrom pipeline explosion and gives his take on the delicate interplay among China, Germany, and the US. Let's dive deep into Simon's insights as we prepare for these uncertain economic times.
That's going to help produce this response by central banks.
Earlier, you mentioned the Nordstrom pipeline, and I'm assuming you're referring to the explosion that happened there. That, of course, is the pipeline connecting Germany and Russia, and various conspiracy theories as to who may have caused that explosion, with some pointing fingers at the US.
Well, I go along with what the famous American journalist said, that it was an American operation.
That has indeed been one of the theories out there. So you're saying the US really fears a China, Russia, German alliance?
Well, that's what they've been trying to break up.
I mean, what would that mean for Germany and its role in the EU and NATO, for that matter?
Well, I think it's very interesting that German industrialists are still investing in China. The big German chemical company is investing 10 billion in a new petrochemical plant in China. And in contrast to the German industrialists, the politicians seem to be heavily influenced by America. So you've got the industrialists saying, we don't believe you, and the politicians listening to America. So there's an internal division growing in Germany, and how it plays out is going to be very interesting. But what you can see across Europe at the moment is a large percentage of the population not agreeing with what their politicians are, the extent to which their politicians are supporting Ukraine. I mean, look at France, look at the demonstrations in Germany. They're huge. You pose a very interesting question. What is the future of the EU? I think it's very interesting that the head of the Bundesbank actually made a statement saying we can no longer afford to finance the deficits of other EU countries. We can't afford it. I think the interesting way of looking at it is, how will this impact fiscal and monetary policy? So I think that by the autumn, most G7 countries will be in recession. The war will have intensified. Central banks will be very concerned, and led by the Fed, we will see the G7 central banks either by the autumn or in the fourth quarter completely turning policy upside down by turning the credit taps full on. Because by the autumn on our work, we will see most global equity markets falling by 30 to 35%. That's going to help produce this response by central banks. So what then happens?
before we get to that, when you said G7 countries in a recession by the autumn, by the beginning of the fourth quarter, does that include the US, where chances of recession have been downplayed? Goldman Sachs revising its outlook for a recession, for example, amongst others. You think the US will be in a recession by Q4?
I think the evidence is very strong that the US will be in recession. It's being held up, the view has been held up by the employment data. But if you look at the two surveys, it's the establishment surveys that everybody focuses on. But the household survey possibly is more accurate. And that's actually telling you the opposite picture. The establishment survey suffers from two impediments. One, it does not include temporary workers, which have become an increasingly large part of the employment situation. And secondly, their own admission that the responses to their surveys have fallen. So how accurate is that survey? As I say, if you look at the household survey, it's actually telling you that the employment figures actually got pretty weak. And then you have to look at the corporate response. Corporations first cut hours worked, which they have been doing. And it's only when you are physically in recession that they lay off workers. And I think that's what we will see over the summer months. If you look at, for instance, people keep talking about Dr. Copper. Dr. Copper is the lead indicator. Well, if you talk to anybody selling physical copper in America, they'll tell you America is in recession. Physical demand is falling sharply. Don't forget, there's a long lag between monetary tightening and its impact on households and businesses. And you can see, Germany is in a technical recession.
Okay.
And if you look at, all the information that I'm picking up is businesses slowing down pretty rapidly in Europe. And I can tell you that in China, despite what the government puts out, business is very disappointing. Order books, the second quarter, are pretty lousy. Big question marks about the second half of the year. The government's focus is much more on focusing on the country's debt issues, particularly local governments, than it is on stimulating the economy. So growth in China this year will disappoint. At the moment, the market has assumed it's a benign outcome. It's not going to be a benign outcome. When the market starts seeing that it's not a benign outcome, they'll take a different view. So it's a combination of all of these factors.
Okay, which would lead to an equity sell-off. Where would that money?
An equity sell-off, complete change in central bank policy. So you will then get, in 2024, you will get the second wave of inflation. And the second wave is always the damaging one, as Paul Volcker found out in the second half of the 70s and early 80s. And the dollar falls off sharply, inflation rises. So all the inflation hedges get bought, equity markets soar, commodity markets soar. And that, of course, leads to the big dangers in 25 and 26. Because what happens to long-term interest rates? It's the long end of the curve that central banks can't control. And I think there's a real risk that we'll see 10-year treasuries yielding well over 10%. What's that going to do to a very highly leveraged global system? 3% was bad enough. 10% plus, it is that which will lead us into either a very deep recession, or I think the risk of it being a depression is very high. And I don't think we get into to trend growth until the early 2030s. I suspect that certainly the leadership in China is fully aware of the frailty of the G7's financial system. And I think for the last 2 years, they've actually been planning for it. I think in the last hurrah, as I call it, for equity and commodity markets in 2024 and early 2025, it's the opportunity to prepare for very difficult years ahead, not just 1 year, but probably 5 years. So that's my advice to everybody. Prepare for the worst, just as China has its contingency plans for the worst.